Is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion worth playing? Yes. There's a ton of different things in this game that I absolutely love, and only a few things that I don't. But this is definitely a very unique Final Fantasy title, and in fact, I think it's the weirdest Final Fantasy title, and one of the most strangest video games that I've ever played, but it's a good weird for sure. And I primarily think that I find it strange because of the origin of Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. For those of you that don't know, Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core is a spin-off of the original Final Fantasy VII, and the original Crisis Core was a PlayStation Portable exclusive that was released way back in 2007, and it was a total hit. It was considered a great game primarily through the impressive gameplay, wonderful graphics, huge scope, and the fact that all of this was on a handheld was just magnificent, but also because it was just a really solid game overall, and it tackles a very requested backstory of a major Final Fantasy VII character, Zack. I got the game as a gift when it initially came out, and I really liked it. It was actually my first foray into the Final Fantasy VII universe, and of course I had no idea what was going on, and I really didn't understand anything in the game, and I didn't even finish it either. I think I got about halfway through or so, I got stuck, and then I just never picked it up again. But again, I did really like the game and I had fun with it. But now that I'm embarking on the journey to play through all the modern Final Fantasy VII universe games, and seeing how I recently played and completed Final Fantasy VII Remake and made a video on it, if you haven't checked that out, go ahead and check that out. It was time for me to hop into Crisis Core Reunion, and this time it was time for me to see it all the way through. I was honestly surprised at how much I got into the game, but Crisis Core is not a mainline Final Fantasy title. It's definitely a spin-off, and it deviates pretty significantly from the original Final Fantasy VII formula. So then, what exactly is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core? Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core is basically a wild combination of a hack-and-slash RPG that has a campaign and side missions, and it explores the story of Zack from the original Final Fantasy VII. Zack is introduced much later on in the original Final Fantasy VII, so I won't go into details here, but I'll definitely discuss his role in the Final Fantasy VII universe and just the general topic of this story in much greater detail later on in the spoiler section. But for simplicity's sake, this is essentially a prequel to Final Fantasy VII, and it focuses on Zack's story. Again, I picked up the original on the PSP, and I had no idea what was going on. So, you at least need to have played the original Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy VII Remake in order to understand the story here. And now that there's a remake of Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core in the form of Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion that can be played on modern consoles or PC, this is definitely the way that you want to experience Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. But unlike Final Fantasy VII Remake, this Crisis Core remake, which is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion, is pretty much just a straight up remake with better graphics, better gameplay, etc. There are some changes, for sure, but it's not a remake in the sense of Final Fantasy VII the original versus Final Fantasy VII Remake, where Remake is just a completely different game. So here in Crisis Core Reunion, there's just a ton of quality of life improvements, gameplay improvements, etc. that I'll hop onto a little bit later in the video. And again, I've played both the original and this remake, so I can definitely tell the difference between the two, and the remake is the way to go. But before we drag this on any longer, let's hop into the story. The story and plot. No major spoilers. Again, the story of Crisis Core is based around Zack, which is the main character and the only playable character of the game. As far as Zack goes as a character, I kind of love him here, and I really like his story. What specifically I like about him is how different he is from a lot of the other characters from the original Final Fantasy VII. And in this game, I really enjoy seeing the growth of him throughout the years. He's very much like a fun version of Cloud, and he's just very, very likable. However, here in Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, the writing and voice acting are pretty atrocious.
Genesis.
This is the most poorly written Final Fantasy title that I've ever played. But this also kind of makes sense because this game was created for the PSP back in 2007. And Reunion pretty much keeps the exact same writing with some new voice acting. So maybe the voice acting isn't really the problem because these actors can only do so much with the script that they're given. But regardless, the story is just really bad, which is a shame because I liked the plot overall. The plot focuses on, of course, Zack and his time in Soldier, and seeing how this connects to some of the other major characters in the original Final Fantasy VII, and how they developed into the characters that we see in the original Final Fantasy VII. But the main conflict here is actually centered around some new characters, Angeal and Genesis. I'm a bit ambivalent about the addition of these characters, and this is probably because the writing is just so bad. But I think they're both just kind of bland characters when you compare them, especially to Zack and the original Final Fantasy VII cast. Angeal's kind of a straight-laced, tough father figure for Zack in the story, and I don't think that's a bad thing to have here. I just think that the writing's really, really bad, and it makes this a not particularly likable character. Zack's writing is also extremely bad. However, I did still find him to be very likable and enjoyable as a main character, and I can't really tell you why, but I just found him very likable. I do not feel this way about Angeal at all. Genesis is the main villain of the game, and he's definitely more interesting than Angeal is. He's essentially a crazy poet type, maniacal, evil, standard bad guy, and because of the circumstances of everything that turned him from a good guy to a bad guy, etc., and now it's our time to stop him and all that. But as the plot goes, you have Angeal, Genesis, and Sephiroth all being a part of Zack's training into making him the next top-tier soldier prospect, and get him from second class to first class. Again, something happens, Genesis becomes evil, and then Zack, Angeal, Sephiroth go out to find Genesis and put it into him. The plot gets much deeper than this later on, and there's definitely some twists that happen early on that drive a ton of intrigue, and really does kind of help push the story through and sparks your interest as well. But again, all of it is just severely hindered by the poor writing. And of course, there is the issue of this being a prequel. There definitely are some points of the story that you totally know they're going to happen before they happen if you played the original Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy VII Remake, and you definitely should play one or the other or both, because this game's going to make no sense to you if you haven't. But on the other hand, it's also really interesting because a lot of the plot points and story sections here that you already know that's going to happen are pretty cool to see again, but here fleshed out in 3D, especially if you only played the original Final Fantasy VII. Overall, I really enjoyed the plot to this game, and I love what they're trying to do here with this game, but the writing is just atrocious. It's terrible. So that definitely really dropped my enjoyment of the story overall. But thankfully, arguably the other main thing about this game that a Final Fantasy fan would come to this game for is really good. The battle system. The battle system here in Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core is very unique and really strange and potentially complicated. So I'm going to try and break it down and explain what I think about each section of the battle system. For a basis, the battle system is fundamentally a hack and slash RPG battle system. Zack has one sword that cannot be changed out, one attack button, one dodge button, a block button, and a button to lock onto enemies. Every action here is very smooth and combat feels really good, even with just these few mechanics. But on top of this, you also have materia that goes into specific slots that pop up when you hold down the left shoulder button that can perform various different actions of the materia that are in them. Initially, these slots are only limited to 4, and they correspond with the face buttons of the controller, but then later on you unlock 2 more that correspond to the 2 right shoulder buttons. All of these slots are remappable with various different materia, so it's really customizable. The materia here in this game range from spells, special attacks, stat buffs, etc. And again, in order to use materia, you need to expend magic points, which are also known as MP, or AP, which are action points. The MP is for spell materia, AP is for attack materia. In the beginning of the game, the combat and the materia system are fairly simple, and what you would expect from a system like this. However, later on, the system turns the game basically into a true RPG, where your character build means everything in battle. I'll get back to this in a bit, but let's finish with the setup with the last major aspect of this battle system, and probably the defining feature of the combat system, the DMW, or Dream Mind Wave. The Dream Mind Wave is essentially a slot machine that is supposed to represent Zack's emotions towards various different characters that he meets throughout the game, and automatically runs when you're in battle at the top left corner. Now, the DMW is very complicated and has a huge impact on battles and just the game overall. But to break it down, it's basically a double slotted machine where you have pictures and numbers running at all times, in battle that is, and at certain intervals it'll stop spinning and it'll act as a slot machine does. You're not in control when it stops, and you can't directly influence the results of it, so the pulls are independent of what you're doing in battle. Now, these pulls are very sophisticated and complicated, and it's constantly running in the background, that you never see exactly what's going on with this. But there are outside factors that affect it, like where you are at in the story, the performance of your last battle, the build that you have, and the amount of experience points that you have as well, along with a ton of other things. But what happens in these pulls? Again, it's double slotted, but I'll start with the characters. When you pull 3 portraits of the same character, you get a limit break of sorts, and you can activate that during battle. There are 6 character portraits, 6 summon portraits, and 6 special summon portraits. For the characters, it's pretty straightforward. You'll get some sort of limit break that either does damage to one enemy, a few enemies, or all enemies, or you'll get a massive healing or buff or something of that sort. Along with this, most of the limit breaks, not all of them, but most of them, you automatically get a heal and a significant portion of your MP and AP being replenished. So it's a huge advantage to get these pulls. And even though it's completely random, it's not infrequent. at all. If it's a longer battle, you'll get several of these pulls, and if it's a short battle, you might get 1 or 2 pulls. The summons, however, are in a different category, not only because they're summons, but also because it's a completely different slot wheel that pops up. And the reason for this is because they changed the name of the wheel and how it functions, and they essentially called it the summon mode. This is differentiated from the standard wheel because it's far less likely for this to happen. So it's far less likely from the standard mode to go to the summon mode. I think it's like a 16% chance overall or something like that, and it usually happens from when pulls fail from previous attempts or something like that. Like I said, it's extremely complicated. I don't want to get into it. And the chances of hitting a summon are even more complicated once you get more summons in the game. So there's a chance you can go into summon mode and not get a summon. But if that happens, there's a chance that it can go into another mode, which is even less likely, which is called the Chocobo mode, which is essentially the additional set of 6 summons. All of the pictures from the first set are acquired naturally as you progress through the story, that being the character portraits. The summons are primarily unlocked after you initially encounter the summon in the story, and then you choose to refight it in the side quest called missions, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. The Chocobo summons are actually fairly obscure in the way that you obtain them, and each one's a little bit different. And all 18 pictures and summons have a level associated with them that directly correlates with the power of their attacks, heals, buffs, and this number is leveled up by simply using the limit breaks or the summons once you obtain them. All the limit breaks and summons are super cool, and I do kind of like this randomness aspect associated with them, and they're a huge fun factor in the game. It's just really confusing how exactly it works, and just a little gripe, the summons animations are, I think, up-res versions of the PSP animations, which I remember how they were back in the day. They were super cool, and they're super cool here, but they look really low res, and it would have been awesome if they would have remastered these animations because they're super cool. The second part of the DMW is the numbers located on the left of the pictures. The numbers go from 1 to 7, and if you pull certain combinations of numbers, you get some type of buff. Within these numbers, 7 is a special number, so even if you land 1 7, you get some type of buff. And then if you land 2 7s, you get a much bigger buff. If you land all 3, Zack levels up. When Zack levels up, it's basically just a straight stat increase across the board, and he can only level up when it rolls 3 7s. But the stats here in Crisis Core are the standard stats for most RPGs, nothing too exciting here. But the materia that you have equipped are also leveled up through the DMW, but not by rolling the 3 7s. Each materia has a specific number combination that needs to be rolled, and then once it's rolled, if there's enough experience to level up the materia, it'll automatically level up, but only if those numbers are rolled. And same thing with Zack. Once he gets enough experience and rolls the 3 7s, that's when he levels up. If he doesn't have enough experience at the 3 7s, he doesn't level up. But to be honest with you, I had no idea this is how Zack leveled up or how materia leveled up, really until I was looking it up for this video. So essentially, it's inconsequential when you're playing the game. So you see what I mean about this game kind of being strange? The actual battling of the game is excellent, and it feels super smooth, and it's a ton of fun. And it's very flexible and dependent on the build, especially in some of the in-game missions. But speaking of missions, the missions and the campaign. So I want to bring this video back to the fact that this game was initially designed for the PSP back in 2007. You don't only see this in the weird storytelling and also the poor writing, potentially poor voice acting, etc., but you also see this in the game design. This game is essentially designed around very short bursts of combat and missions. And because they wanted this to be a worthy spin-off of the original Final Fantasy VII, they have a bunch of these little short bursts of combat, and the story is sizable. The missions are something that you get access to very early on and are prevalent throughout the entire game. And the main game is essentially the campaign, which is a fairly linear experience. It has you going from one place to another, fighting, doing mini games and puzzles, experiencing the story, and surprisingly, it's a lot of fun. So the campaign's really just straightforward and basically just a good means for you to experience Zack's story. The missions, however, are where I'd say the bulk of the game actually is. And this is where it was really impressive as a handheld game. There's a ton of missions here, like a ton. I spent about 25 hours in total with this game before I completed it, and I kid you not, I'd say about 60% of this was in the missions. And at the end, I was only about 50% of the way through all of the missions. I think I was around 47 or so. There's so many missions in this game. The reasons that I played the missions more than the campaign was primarily because I was having fun with it. And it was a good time. The missions as a whole are typically pretty short, to the point, and just straightforward combat, where at the end you fight a boss and you collect treasures throughout the mission if you want. And they have very useful items in them. And again, this is where we go back to that handheld design. A lot of short bursts. For a handheld system, these short missions are ideal. For the most part, handheld gaming is typically not done for hours at a time. It's usually in short bursts. So having a long cinematic experience or long fights or other experiences that are really long would definitely have not been appealing to people back in 2007. Nowadays, handheld gaming transcends the modality of the old school handhelds, where now for the most part handhelds are more of a way for you to pick up where you left off from a docked gaming environment like Switch, Steam Deck, PlayStation Portal. But back in 2007, the technology just wasn't there to have this be a thing. So the game that you had in your handheld was exclusively for that device, and this was for better and for worse. So handheld games had to be designed around this aspect, and that's where we have these short missions come from. But even though this was made for a handheld and it's kind of designed around it, here in the remake they're still really fun. I never felt like the original design of the missions was holding back the fun factor, especially because there's so many of them, and that they're more significantly difficult than the campaign, and they have much better rewards. And legitimately, there were some missions where I unlocked and I just straight up could not beat them. I had to come back to them hours later and beat them. A lot of them were super challenging, which is great. However, the campaign I totally breezed right through. I initially had a little bit more of a challenging experience with the campaign, that being before I unlocked the mission selection, but after about 25% of the way through the mission completion rate, I was overpowered in the campaign, and it almost wasn't fun. And that's also why I stopped at the 47% mark as well. In fact, I actually beat the final boss for the campaign in this game in just a few seconds, because I created a build where I was very overpowered and it was just super easy. So now let me talk about my build for a little bit. But before we do that, if you're enjoying the video, please do me a favor and hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, especially if you want to see more videos like this. It really helps out more than you think, and I would really appreciate it. And 97% of you are not subscribed. Can you please help me out by hitting that little red button down there? And if you like the video, hit the like button. More videos coming soon, I promise. Also, if you haven't checked out some of my other videos, I'd really appreciate it as well. Thank you. Now back to the video. How I broke the game. Here in Crisis Core, there's a materia set in the game that you can get really early on, and that I got about halfway through the game, that just makes every fight trivial, especially in the campaign. This is the Hell set, and it has Hell Blizzaga, Hell Fireaga, and Hell Thundaga. The Blizzaga, Fireaga, and Thundaga are basically the most powerful versions of Blizzard, Fire, and Thunder, which are the three main magical spells of the game. The Hell versions of the Aga spells are special because they can inflict certain statuses on enemies that they're used on. The primary status is Death. Death primarily affects weaker enemies, as stronger enemies are immune to it, but even the stronger enemies get hit with statuses like Silence or Stop, especially on bosses. These materia alone are not what I broke the game with, but when I combined them with material that boosts your magic attack and your MP, because these spells cost a lot of MP, and the main way of boosting your magic attack power is by adding materia that does that. Once you have that quintuplet of materias, you're basically unstoppable, at least in the campaign. And in the missions, you can kind of cruise through them very easily, especially if you're under leveled. But there are kind of some soft caps that you hit, where basically you can't do any more damage or you can't get any more MP for one reason or another. But that's where fusing materia comes into handy. So after maybe about the 1/3 mark of the campaign, you get the ability to fuse materia together, and the way that this works is dependent on the materia that are being fused. Typically, if you're infusing materia in similar functions, the one with the higher level, indicated by a 5-star leveling system, where the 1-star is weak and the 5-star is strong, usually stays as the same materia but with better stats or attributes. Better way to describing it. So if you fuse a level 5 mastered cure spell that has a vitality +5 and a level 1 cure spell that has a vitality +2, then the fused materia will most likely be the mastered cure spell, but with like a vitality of +6. And when you're fusing these materia, you can also add standard items that increase certain stats as well. But some spells kind of do some funky fusions too. Like for instance, if you fuse fire and blizzard together, it makes thunder, which I mean, that kind of makes sense if you think about it. But for some really weird ones, if you fuse Quake and HP together, you get Wall, which if you really think deep about it, maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. But it's a system you kind of have to play around with or look up a guide for, which is fun. I like that. I like this system a lot. But somewhat early on in the game, you get a special materia that I think there's only one of in the game. I only saw one that allows you to start this Hell Trio. It's called Dark Blizzaga. It's basically a lesser version of Hell Blizzaga, but the deal with this is if you fused a Mastered Blizzaga with the Mastered Dark Blizzaga, you get Hell Blizzaga. And again, you can get this really early on in the game. So I did this just accidentally by basically trying to increase the power of the Dark Blizzaga and seeing how I maxed out the Blizzaga before acquiring the Dark Blizzaga. I thought might as well just put it to good use and combine the two. And I found out it made Hell Blizzaga. And once I did this, I was on cruise mode for pretty much the rest of the game, except for some of the hard missions. The problem with this is there are some enemies that are immune or absorb ice damage. And some of the mid-level missions are definitely pretty tough. And there's a lot of missions that you're under level for early on, just stat wise, but it does so much damage with the status inducing impact of it. It allows you to tackle a lot early on. But I liked this build that I had kind of already made, and I knew I wanted to keep doing something like this. So I basically toughed out a few difficult missions where I was kind of stuck on because I was just so under level for them, and I finally got the Hellfire Aga and the Hell Thundaga, along with a Cure Aga. So I knew this was the build that I wanted. But I was having a few issues with having enough MP and also doing enough damage with each spell. So I equipped all 4 of the spells, that being the Hell Trio and the Cure Aga, and an MP up plus, which the plus is better than the regular MP up or MP up plus, just gives you more MP up, and a magic up plus, and then I was just back to cruising for a while anyway. Both stat boosting materia more than doubled my MP and my damage, so the materia here are really impactful on your overall build. However, there were still some missions I was having trouble with, especially with not having enough HP. So now I'm kind of really stuck. I have all 6 materia slots equipped, and I have some of the best armor pieces in the game in all my armor slots. Oh yeah, there's armor in this game too. It's just essentially increase certain stats or potential buffs, debuffs, etc. But the question was, how could I get more HP with all 6 materia slots already equipped? Again, I had to look up a decent amount of stuff on this game for this video, so I didn't really know about how a lot of these systems worked, and I really didn't want to. I just kind of wanted to go into it blind and have fun with it. And I was only stuck on missions and not the campaign at all. I was flying through the campaign. So to me, I was kind of thinking of the missions as side quests and whatnot, so I really just wanted to do some trial and error. And through this, I found something really cool. While I was kind of stuck on this low HP problem, I had an idea of just trying to fuse all of the extra materia that I had to get a really good singular materia. That being because I only had 6 slots to put these materia in. Through doing this, I accidentally put my mastered Hellblizzaga and a mastered MP up together, and I saw that it would give me a mastered Hellblizzaga with a 320% increase in my MP. The mastered Hellblizzaga had a magic plus 25 from not only being the master materia, but also from the combinations of the prior 2 master materias, with that being the dark Blizzaga along with the regular master Blizzaga. So now I had figured out something really special. I could change the status of the materia associated with these builds based off of different materia that I fuse it with. So the idea automatically came to my mind. All of the materia that I really need is the Hell Trio and Cure Aga, and I can put all the staff buffs into these 4 different materia. So now it was on. I fused Hell Blizzaga, Hellfire Aga, and Cure Aga to something like magic plus 39 on Hell Blizzaga, MP up 330% on Hellfire Aga, and a 400% increase in HP on the Cure Aga. And on top of this, I freed up 2 materia slots where I put a mastered status ward, which gives you immunity to any of the stats that you have equipped on the materia that you have, aka all the status effects that the Hell Trio induce, like death, silence, stop, etc. And I put another magic up materia because why not? At this point, I wasn't just cruising through the game, I was steamrolling it. And once I did this, I was beating bosses in seconds. While this was super fun coming up with this idea and putting the build together and seeing it all in action, and even using it, I definitely think something was lost here. I basically just didn't use my sword or AP materia once I got Hellblizzaga, which is, again, this was pretty early in the game, but not as early as it could have been. But I also think this is kind of the point of the game as well. You can absolutely make the opposite of what I just built and exclusively only use AP and normal attacks and ignore magic completely. In fact, for some of the tougher mission bosses, you have to do this. And the game gives you enough resources to make both a magic and a physical build. So I had to make a physical build to beat some of these bosses. Yet, even with having the 2 types of builds, I do think the magic build is definitely better though. But I think what I disliked most here was really just the balance between the campaign and the missions. The missions are so much harder than the campaign is right from the jump. The campaign was laughably easy once I got about at a 45% completion rate in the missions, but the missions were relatively challenging the entire time. And I do think that the campaign should be easier than the missions because the missions are essentially side quests, but this is way too much. And really, I just wish the campaign was harder. I think the missions are appropriate difficulty level. And in fact, I think I would have liked to have seen a game where you needed to complete at least 50% of the missions in order to be powerful enough to tackle the final boss. And that's essentially where I got to, and I beat the final boss in seconds. But still, it was really fun making this build and doing some of the really difficult missions. And I think the missions are very fun. Okay, now let's get into the juicy stuff. The story. Spoilers. Alright, you know the deal. This is the spoiler section where I'm going to talk about characters, the story, and of course the ending. So if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to this timestamp now. 3, 2, 1. I really like Zack and I like the plot of this story. But again, the writing is just not good at all.
Why did you hurt Tifa? Answer me! Sephiroth!
There are moments of brilliance here though, but they're only moments. The original Final Fantasy VII Zack is such a mysterious and interesting character due to how much he influences the main character of the game, that being Cloud, and how little we know of him or see of him in the game. So having this game tackle the story of Zack is super interesting and a really cool idea. And the story overall is interesting. The execution of it and sitting through this kind of sucks though. But somehow I still really like Zack as a character, and I think the ending of this game is actually very strong. Let's go back to the beginning and the expectations for this game. In the original Final Fantasy VII, we're given kind of the cliff notes of the version of Zack's story, so we roughly know how this game is going to play out if you've played the original one. So immediately, I'm kind of looking for a few things with the story. I want to know who Zack is, how he meets Aerith, I want to see their relationship develop, and I want to see how Zack meets Cloud. And a bonus would be seeing how he dies. Half of these are done very well, and half are done halfingly well. That's not a word, but we'll go with it. Let me explain. You really get to see who Zack is here in this game, and his growth throughout the story. Again, writing's terrible, but the character development is awesome. It really does feel like Zack is a young pup in the first act, and then he evolves into a young adult in the middle act, and then in the final act, he's a proper leader. I like the idea of Zack before the game, and I really like him now after this game. I like how different he is from Cloud as well. I think that's really interesting. And again, I think he's more of just a fun, outgoing Cloud. And I really enjoyed him in this game. We also get to see how he met Aerith and how they developed their relationship. And this is the halfingly done well part that I was talking about. The way that they meet is very cool and kind of a callback to the original game. And I really like that. Even though technically this is the prequel and Cloud's meaning of Aerith would technically be the callback, but whatever. But the interactions between these two are a bit rough because of the writing. I will say, however, the moments when Zack is thinking about Aerith, kind of throughout the game, but especially at the end, is really done very well. And honestly, when Aerith's thinking about Zack is done very well too. Unfortunately, they're better when they're not together on screen. I still really like them as a couple though, and it was cool seeing their story. I love how at the end, Zack finds Aerith's last letter to him, which is her 89th letter, I think, and he hasn't received any of them because he's been in captive for the past 4 years, and how much this letter impacts him and how much he's reflecting on him and Aerith. I really love this part. This also kind of changed my views on Aerith and Cloud. I stated in my last video, in the Final Fantasy VII Remake video, which if you haven't watched, you should go check it out. I really liked Cloud and Aerith in that game, and I said that I might be switching sides because in the original game, I was definitely a Tifa guy, and in the remake, I was kind of more of an Aerith guy. But yeah, no. I want to see Aerith and Zack get together again. I think they match each other's energy very well, a lot better than Aerith and Cloud, and I just want to see more of them together, and done well this time. And based on the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake, I have a feeling we might. I haven't played Rebirth yet, working on it. We also get to see how Zack met Cloud, and it is kind of shoehorned in here, which kind of sucks, but I guess it's kind of okay. The dynamic between these two, I think, is great. Again, terrible writing, but the vibes are good. Seeing this version of Cloud is also neat as well, because it's very different from the original Cloud. Here in Crisis Core, Cloud is much happier, much more lively and social, and a little bit anxious. Zack almost acts as a big brother to Cloud here too, and again, I love the dynamic between these two. I think that they kind of have that big brother, little brother, but also friend dynamic, and it's just wonderful. Surprisingly, Sephiroth is heavily involved in the story, and I loved it. Sephiroth acts as one of the side mentors to Zack, and then later on a colleague, and honestly, he seems like a decent dude for majority of the game. Very bold, confident, maybe even a bit arrogant, but he's fairly nice to Zack and other people throughout the game. And then of course there's the big shift, where Sephiroth becomes the Sephiroth that we know in the original Final Fantasy VII. And it's done pretty well here. Again, bad writing, solid plot. And then of course, we have Zack's death, which I think is almost handled perfectly. Leading up to his death, there's such a sadness in the air in the final fight that ultimately leads to the cutscene where Zack is killed. I think what makes this so exceptional here is that you not only get to fight as him against the Shinra army, but also as he's weak and kind of dying off. You really get to see kind of the suffering and the dying of this character. And then as he's dying, we get to see remembrances of all of his loved ones with a particular emphasis on Aerith, which again drives home their relationship and really makes me like them as a couple. And then at the very end, you see Cloud coming out of his Mako poisoning as Zack's dying, and Cloud and Zack get a wonderful chance to say goodbye. It's an exceptional send-off. And of course, we see Zack giving Cloud the famous Buster Sword. And then you have Cloud screaming out in pain and Zack going up to heaven. And then you have Angeal welcoming him to heaven. And I should probably talk about Angeal and Genesis for a little bit. I didn't really talk about them much here in the story because I think they suck. I don't think they're good additions to the Final Fantasy VII universe, and I don't think they're particularly important. There's nothing essentially wrong here with them, but almost every main character, even the main side characters of the Final Fantasy VII universe, are at least somewhat interesting, and I just don't think either one of these characters are interesting pretty much at all. Angeal is a very bland character, and Genesis is just like a lesser version of Sephiroth. However, I did really like the addition of Cissonne in the Turks, and I think Song in the Turks is really good here. Song is much more likable here, and is kind of more understood as a character. I really like Song here, and I kind of now have a soft spot for the Turks. Cissonne is just an awesome, bubbly addition to the Turks. I also really like how she lets Zack get away towards the end, and how Song kind of knows that this is happening and he's okay with it. And I like how Song kept all the letters from Aerith that she sent out to Zack so that he could give it to Zack whenever he finds them, and that's the priority versus catching him. I think this is like huge character development for him. This is great. I really hope we see more of these in Rebirth. Again, haven't played it, working on it, video coming soon. But I'll make a bet that we do see him, especially in like some of the side content or whatnot. So we'll check in on that video. And I'm really excited for it. But overall, story was done poorly just because the writing and everything like that. But the plot, really loved it. Conclusion. I really enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion. I liked it back when it was on the PSP, and I had no idea what was going on. And now that it's on modern consoles with a ton of quality of life improvements, and now that I know what's going on, I like it even more. Zack's story is a really good Final Fantasy VII story, and I'm glad that I experienced it. The writing here is atrocious, as I've said for probably the 100th time now, and I can't help but wonder how good this game would have been with better writing. The main villain is also weak, the main father figure character is also somewhat bland, but the plot and the depiction of some of the vital events from the original Final Fantasy VII are done very well. Some of them could have been done a little bit better, but in general it's very solid. Everything that I wanted to see out of this game coming from the original Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake is here, so I'm satisfied with it. The battle system is an unbalanced mess, but it's a ton of fun, and something that I've never seen before in a Final Fantasy VII title, especially with the DMW system, along with the build crafting. And honestly, I'm not sure we're ever going to see anything like this again, but at least you can experience it here and have a ton of fun with it. The structure of the game is fairly linear and simple with the campaign. The mission structure is actually very unique because it's very focused, bite-sized experiences, and it's honestly the best part of the game. I had a ton of fun with it, and to me that's primarily what this game is: fun. When my journey with this game was over, I felt as if I had gotten what I wanted from the story, but I wasn't floored with it. But I also had a ton of fun battling and building my Zack to be a super OP Zack and just obliterate everything in seconds. So now the question is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion in 2024 worth playing? I certainly think it is. If you liked the video and you want to see more like this, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and hit the bell notification. That way you don't miss out on any future videos. Again, 97% of you are not subscribed. If you can, please subscribe. I appreciate it. And leave a comment and tell me what you thought about the video and what you'd like to see me do next. My Final Fantasy VII universe journey is coming to a final stop with Rebirth. I'm definitely playing that next, and I've even started to play it during the making of this video. But that's going to be a long journey. And I'm also working on some non-Final Fantasy titles as well. I would also really like to do some videos on the Drakengard series. I actually played them back when they released, and spoilers for those videos, I really liked them all. I think that they're an integral part of the Nier universe, so I think it'd be interesting to do some videos on them. So let me know if you want those videos, or let me know what videos you want. Again, thank you all for the support. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I love seeing what y'all think about the video or your opinions on the game in the comments. Also, if you want to help support the channel further, consider becoming a member, get some extra loyalty badges, emojis for comments, and a shout out in my next video. But until then, I wish you all the very best, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye!
Everything's so messed up now. Angeal, just come back to us.